Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Joan Batorf, and I'm a professor in the School of Nursing at the University of British Columbia on the Okanagan campus. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all today. Before we begin, I want to respectfully acknowledge that UBC Okanagan is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. I would also like to acknowledge that some of you might be joining us today from other places, both near and far. And I encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands as well. You will notice a closed captioning button or box that can be moved on your screen. So just move it to wherever you would like. And you can also turn off the closed captioning by using the hide caption button at the bottom of the menu bar. We encourage you to type in questions and comments at any time during the presentation in using the chat box. And we will read out those comments and questions towards the end of the presentation. Today's event is brought to you by the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention at UBC Okanagan. And we're especially delighted to have Dr. P Lougheed with us today, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the Irving Barber Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences on our campus here at UBCO. And we're especially delighted to have her because this week is Canadian Mental Health Week. And as noted in the chat, it's a time to kind of raise voices and to talk about mental health, which is so important to all of us. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Jess, and then we'll have time for some conversation towards the end. So welcome, Jess. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Joan. And again, thank you for having me. It is such an honor to present, especially this week during CMHA's Mental Health Awareness Week. So before I get started and talking about some of the research that I want to focus on today, I will introduce myself. So I'll tell you a little bit about my background, who I am, and what I do. So I'm a developmental psychologist by training, and I focus specifically on emotional development during adolescence, and especially in the context of parent-adolescent relationships. So if you yourself were at one point or currently are a teenager, or perhaps if you're a caregiver to teens, or maybe even a professional who works with them, you likely already know why this is an important topic. I will also talk about what the research says about this later on. And at the heart of my research programs are questions related to these kinds of things. So how do relationships shape who we are and who we become? And in turn, how does development influence our relationships? Of course, central to these types of questions are emotions and mental health, which I will be focusing on a lot today. And I also want to mention as well that as a developmental psychologist, this means that I'm trained as a research scientist. I'm not actually trained as a clinician. So I do not have training in assessing and diagnosing, treating mental health disorders. But as a researcher, what I'm interested in are the general levels in the population of mental health issues like depression, anxiety, because we know that even folks who don't meet the formal diagnostic criteria for, say, major depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder, there are still levels of symptoms that can impact our day-to-day life in a pretty significant way. And so I'll be talking today about research on that level of mental health difficulty rather than more formal diagnosable levels of mental health issues. So given my research interests, I'm so honored to be able to have this conversation today as part of CMHA's Mental Health Week. And the theme this year I absolutely love. It's all about our stories. We all have mental health, and many of us, so about 1 in 5 Canadians, have a mental health difficulty of some kind. And we know that just like our physical health, our mental health needs to be well maintained so that we can thrive. Because I'm so focused on developmental science, I know that our stories are not set in stone forever. Of course, we're shaped by our experiences, and when bad or difficult things happen to us, such as a personal loss or perhaps a global pandemic, of course, they can play a big role in our development. That being said, we also have the capacity at all ages to find new paths forwards and to play some role in shaping our own stories as well. So before I get into the main topic today, looking at how the pandemic is related to mental health for families, especially with adolescents, I want to just review some key features of adolescent development that will help move us forward in that conversation today. What is happening developmentally during the adolescent years, and how does it intersect with relationships with primary caregivers? Let's have a little bit of an overview. So we know that adolescence is a time of changes in many developmental domains, one of them being adolescent brain development. And so this is the current model that is led by research from Dr. Casey's lab, as well as a lot of other well-renowned researchers. We have this model of adolescent brain development pointing to an imbalance between different regions of the brain. And this is really important because what we see in adolescence is that the so-called reward system of the brain, more specifically the limbic regions associated with things like emotions, those parts of the brain tend to develop really quickly around the ages of 13 to 15 years old. At the same time, other regions of the brain that are implicated in things like self-control, so things like the prefrontal cortex, which is this part of our brain, it develops a lot more slowly. And in fact, these prefrontal regions might not be fully developed until around the age of 25 years old. So our brains take a long time to develop. And importantly, in adolescence, what this means is that there's this developmentally typical gap between, even at the brain level, what's going on with our emotions and our self-control. So that's kind of shown in that middle portion of the region where the limbic regions are developing a lot faster in comparison to the prefrontal regions, which develop a lot more slowly. We know that emotions become more intense and also more variable in adolescence. So not only are they experienced more strongly, but they also fluctuate a lot more. They also become more complicated. So when I'm talking about emotional complexity, one research term that we use is emotional granularity, which confusingly has also been called emotional differentiation. And emotional differentiation is the ability to separate our emotional experiences into different emotion types. Basically, how specifically can someone distinguish between different emotions? Developmentally, we know that there are some patterns. So in infancy, we know that up until a certain age, infants can only experience the general domains of emotions in terms of pleasant or unpleasant, good or bad. But emotions become more differentiated through development. Although we also know that even in adulthood, some people have greater abilities to differentiate emotions than others. So everyone can be different. So to make this a little bit more concrete, someone who has high emotional differentiation can distinguish between a lot of different emotions that might share things in common, like feeling depressed, bored, tired, and miserable. Or they also might have awareness of complex emotions, like times where we might feel angry at someone, but perhaps we also feel ashamed for feeling angry at them, right? Do you see what I mean in terms of our emotional experiences can be highly differentiated, and this changes over development? Perhaps not surprisingly, emotional differentiation is important for our mental health. Part of it is that when we know what emotions we are feeling, we are better equipped to be able to apply the appropriate emotion regulation strategy when we have big feelings. So this was data here from a recent study from Dr. Somerville's lab, led by Dr. Eric Nook. And so this scatter plot here shows the emotional differentiation score. Higher levels on this y-axis are higher emotional differentiation. And then they looked at people of different ages from 5 years old to 25 years old. So this is a very cool data set. And the way that they interpret these results are that in the period from middle childhood to pre-adolescence, emotions start to becoming a lot more complicated. And because of that, granularity or emotional differentiation decreases because kids don't yet have that formal, abstract, concrete thinking ability that can really help them understand those emotions. Then in the teen years, there's this period of time where granularity or emotional differentiation is even lower, which can lead to emotions being complex and unclear at the same time. And then as we transition into early adulthood, also called emerging adulthood, emotions become clearer and more specific with age. So we typically keep that emotional complexity, but we also have the ability to understand them better. So coming back to adolescence, what happens when these two developmental processes co-occur as they do in adolescence? Well, we can think about how we have a period of high emotionality, with emotions at times being relatively complex and unclear, coupled with relatively low self-control. Whenever I talk about this type of thing, I also just want to be aware that there are a lot of stereotypes about adolescence, and that I think as a culture, we have this view of adolescence as stereotypically this period of storm and stress, and everything's going to be awful and hard. And it is for some people, but it's not for all teens. So yes, in general, we do see this trend towards more complex emotions, slightly lower emotional differentiation, without yet having the regulatory skills to navigate those emotional challenges on their own. But this isn't the case for all youth. Okay, so taking this context, there are also a lot of changes that happen in adolescents' relationships to their primary caregivers, such as parents, which I will turn our attention to now. I want to mention I'm using the word primary caregivers here in a way that's inclusive. So I'm referring all together when I say parents to biological parents, step parents, foster parents, adoptive parents, chosen family, anyone who plays that formal primary caregiving role to an adolescent. There are a lot of things that happen to the parent-adolescent relationship, and the adolescent developmental stage is only one piece of that equation, because we know as well, parents continue to develop as well, and oftentimes they're actually navigating transitions through their own midlife development as well. I won't be talking about that today, but it is something that we are researching in my lab right now, so perhaps I will have more updates on that for you, perhaps in another talk, perhaps next year. But in general, what is going on between parents and teens during these adolescent years? The first thing that might come to mind for many of us are images like this one, or perhaps this one, where there's highly conflictual interactions, adolescents aren't listening to their parents and stuff like that. Again, that happens, but it's not the only thing that happens, because we know now from research that parents continue to be a really important source of support for their adolescents as they are navigating a lot of transitions, like transitions to high school, new sports or social activities, perhaps navigating romantic relationships for the first time. So family members and how they are doing in terms of mental health and emotion really affect each other. And adolescence is this time developmentally where their parents can really help them to understand their emotions better. And it's a very crucial time in the lifespan for adolescents and youth learning how to manage their emotions and how to manage their mental health. For families who have adolescents during the pandemic, we know that what typical family life and day-to-day life and what that looked like changed in a really big way. In general, adolescents tend to spend a lot more time at home with their families than they did prior to the pandemic. We know often in adolescence, teens start to spend a lot more time outside of the home, whether it's in structured extracurricular activities or they're spending time with friends, perhaps unsupervised. But all of that changed when there were these widespread lockdown restrictions put in place by many governments across the world. As I talk about research and what it says about mental health during the pandemic, I will be talking about a few different times during the pandemic in chronological order. So I'll first be talking about what research says about what was going on very early in the pandemic, so shortly after lockdown, and then we'll talk about what's kind of going on now. I think too that a lot of us experienced and continue to experience the pandemic and its various phases in very different ways. If we just look back and remember what was going on in BC and thinking about all the various iterations of the government regulations that we had, we know that our daily lives changed quite a lot and sometimes quite frequently too. Back in 2021, there was a special issue of a research journal called The Research of Adolescence that got published. And this was a really exciting thing to be a part of. They published a whole issue of this research journal on the impact of the pandemic on adolescent emotional, social, and academic adjustment. What I'll do now is I'll give some of the key takeaways from research from the special issue, including one of the articles that I published in the special issue And I will say it was such an interesting time, and it continues to be a researcher, because whether we want it or not, basically all of us developmental scientists who study change over time and adolescent development, we all became pandemic researchers, right? We were collecting data before the pandemic hit, and then we continued to collect data while the pandemic was happening, and same with many other researchers that I will share some of the key results with today. One of the key themes that the editors of this special issue articulated really well was this quote that I have up here. So the idea that the pandemic is both a shared historical event and an individually varying one. What this means is that we're all experiencing the same global event, but in some ways we also have our own individual responses to it as well. And one common theme is that studies in this special issue provide evidence of some of the near-term consequences of the pandemic, but also provide some evidence that the overall impact of the pandemic on our mental health is maybe a little bit more mixed than what we would have expected. So perhaps we would have expected that everyone had a really hard time, and perhaps that's true in some ways, but what we do see from the research is that adolescents and their families who experienced the most disruptions to their development are those who tended to be the most vulnerable. So here I'm talking about vulnerability in terms of having less access to financial resources, having marginalized backgrounds, those who have chronic health issues, either for themselves or a family member, and that kind of thing. So that's just kind of a note that is kind of a running theme of today's talk, is that it affected everyone, but it also affected all of us in slightly different ways as well. What specifically happened to adolescents' mood during the early phases of the pandemic? So this was a research study led by a PhD student named Wisteria Dang at Yale. And they used a really interesting method that I will talk about a fair bit today. This is called a daily diary method, which basically involves having individuals, they have an app on their smartphone, and they will be responding to survey questions, not just once, but every single day for some period of time. In this study, it was, I believe, 2 weeks is how long they had adolescents responding to questions every day about their moods and how they experience their day-to-day life. So they did this daily diary procedure from 2 different time points. So first was before the pandemic hit in 2019, and then the pandemic hit, they were able to do another round of collecting these daily diary data in the spring of 2020. In this sample, the adolescents were between the ages of 9 and 15 years old. And again, the 2020 data were from just a few weeks after lockdown restrictions were in place. The specific research questions that they asked were, did adolescents' positive and negative mood change? Did their fluctuations in mood change? So how high and how low do they go on their positive and negative mood? And then they also asked whether rumination was related to changes in mood. So rumination is this thing that we do sometimes, especially if we're anxious, where we tend to think about something over and over and over again, even if it's not serving us, even if we're not actively problem solving. It's just constantly worrying repeatedly about the same thing without actually moving towards problem solving. What they found was that compared to lockdown, negative mood increased in daily life for adolescents, but positive mood did not change. Interestingly, they did not see any changes in how much negative moods varied, but positive moods became less variable. So positive mood became more flat, even if it wasn't any lower, it was just more flat over time. They also found that teens who tended to ruminate before the pandemic hit also showed greater increases in negative mood. So this makes a lot of sense. We know that individuals who tend to ruminate, this tends to co-occur with anxiety. And here we're seeing this idea that, okay, so maybe some of these adolescents who were predisposed to having some more difficulties with regulating their emotions, they showed the most increases to their negative mood once lockdown hit compared to their peers. Another study gave some really interesting data looking at adolescents' relationships and how their relationships impacted their stress early in the pandemic. So this was a study led by colleague Dr. Nicole Campion-Barr. And again, just like a lot of other folks, she had data from before the pandemic, 2017 to 2018. and then relatively early in the pandemic as well, June to July of 2020. And these were adolescents who were living in Missouri and Florida. So they had large samples from both of these very different states. They were asking research questions about how adolescents felt about their relationships to their mothers, fathers, siblings, and best friends. And they were looking at how COVID-19 stress, so specifically stress about getting the virus, having a loved one being sick, having to experience social distancing, so how that specific type of stress was related to the quality of these relationships. And in general, we know from the literature that we tend to see that when teens have higher quality relationships in their lives, they tend to do better at managing different types of stress. So what did they find? The results were really interesting. They found that strong relationships with moms and dads were linked to better adolescent mental health, regardless of how much stress related to the pandemic the adolescents felt. There was also some nuance to these results too. So specifically, strong relationships with their moms was more protective against depression, whereas positive relationships with their fathers was more protective against problem behavior. So things like rule breaking and stuff like that. It was really interesting that the role of relationships with siblings and friends on adolescent mental health was more dependent on how much COVID-19 stress adolescents felt. So they found that having higher quality relationships with peers and their siblings when adolescent COVID-19 stress was higher was actually associated with teens having greater problem behavior. Again, things like rule breaking. So these researchers mentioned that they didn't have the data fully needed to explain this somewhat surprising finding, but it might be related to a process that's called deviancy training in the research literature. So this is this idea that if there are two peers who together are more prone to problem solving, things like rule breaking, they can end up amplifying these behaviors in each other, deviancy training, when that relationship quality is really high, right? So really interesting. High quality relationships are important, but also it depends on who it's with and what the characteristics of the individuals are. The last article I'll present from this special issue before I talk about some more recent data is a study that I was involved with my with my colleague, Dr. Tom Hollenstein at Queen's University, which is in Kingston, Ontario. So like I mentioned, we were in the middle of collecting data for a longitudinal study on adolescents and their mothers, looking at emotion dynamics and how it's related to mental health. But of course, this became a study about the pandemic. And so we had survey data on adolescents and their mothers' depression and anxiety symptoms at two different time points. One being before the pandemic hit in 2019, 2020, before pandemic happened. And then we were able to sneak in an extra data collection period early on between May and June 2020. We were looking specifically at how anxious and depressive symptoms changed from before the pandemic to early pandemic and what was related to those changes. And our results were somewhat surprising. So first of all, this is what we were surprised by. Anxious symptoms were actually lower early in the pandemic for both mothers and adolescents. So this was a bit of a puzzle, but now we know more and I'll be able to explain this. At the same time, we saw that depressive symptoms were higher early in the pandemic for both mothers and adolescents. We also found that these changes varied by the adolescent's gender and also impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So what was really interesting was that anxiety symptoms decreased at lockdown even more for people who were more anxious before the pandemic. Anxious symptoms also decreased more for adolescents who identified as male compared to those who identified as female, which is in line with what we know about gender-related disparities in mental health during adolescence. What we make of this result is that when lockdown hit, our day-to-day lives were transformed in ways that were really challenging, but that also removed a lot of the daily hassles and the daily stressors that we tend to experience, right? So maybe if you think back to yourself about what was going on, perhaps all of a sudden you didn't have to navigate your commute to work. Teens didn't have to go through the possible stress of, will they be rejected when they want to sit by someone at the cafeteria table, or all that kind of stuff, right? And so in some ways, it might make a lot of sense that anxiety decreased when all of those hassles of our daily lives just kind of went away. I think it makes sense that we did see an increase in depressive symptoms because often depression can be related to loss. So we all experience loss of social connection to some extent, other losses perhaps related to jobs, or we could name many, many different types of loss that make a lot of sense for why depressions would have increased. What was also interesting and in line with our expectations was that female adolescents showed greater increases in depressive symptoms than those who identified as male. So again, we know in adolescence that gender differences in mental health symptoms tend to first show up in ways where individuals who identify as female tend to have greater mental health difficulties than those who identify as male. And then, unfortunately, in the sample, we didn't have enough data from youth with other gender identities, such as non-binary or genderqueer or trans youth, to be able to look at specifically what their experience was like, but hopefully we'll see more research on this going forward. The other big thing that we found was that youth who were more strongly impacted by COVID-19, so specifically, this means those who were not able to see their friends at all, those who reported higher stress, and those who also had greater worries about being sick or a family member getting sick, they showed even greater increases in depressive symptoms. So again, coming back to this theme, I want to highlight, yes, we saw these overall trends in this sample, but not everyone was affected equally, right? So we see that who tends to experience greater mental health symptoms, it varies on quite a few different factors, such as gender identity, levels of stress, that kind of thing. Okay, so I've just reviewed some of the key findings about how mental health changed early in the pandemic for adolescents and their families. And now we'll turn our attention to what has been going on more recently. So I'm going to speak about some preliminary results. This is actually a study that's still in progress, but we've been collecting data for over a year now from adolescents and their primary caregivers from here in British Columbia. So far, I'll be presenting data that was collected between March 2022 and March 2023. This is another one of those daily diary studies, so where adolescents and their primary caregivers report once per day for 14 days on all kinds of things, such as their mood, their relationship dynamics. I won't be presenting on data related to that at this moment, but stay tuned for more coming up on that. But what I'll be showing some preliminary results for today have to do with whether fears of COVID have changed in the last year for adolescents and their parents, and whether these fears of COVID are related to mental health. So the specific measure that I'm referring to here is one that measures COVID-19 related anxiety and specific behaviors like avoidance or mitigation behaviors, such as how frequently people are, say, opting not to socialize in person, or how often they're engaging in mask wearing or hand sanitizing and that kind of thing. So these are two plots that show data over time. So for both of these graphs along the y-axis, I've got time. This starts at March 2022 and ends in March 2023. And then along the y-axis, we've got the fears of illness and virus. So these COVID-19 related fears. We've got two separate scatter plots, one for adolescents and one for caregivers. So in these plots, each plot or each dot refers to one person. So we can say, okay, this is a person who in December 2022 had relatively high fears of the illness. So this is how we interpret this graph. What this blue line shows is this is the trend, and we see that it is basically horizontal. So if there were changes, we would see that maybe that line would be sloping upwards or downwards, but it looks like fears of COVID-19, at least in our sample of 85 adolescents and their primary caregivers, there have not been any changes in trends over time. However, I also wanted to point out that we're seeing quite a lot of variation in fears of the illness, both for adolescents and their caregivers. Some are scoring quite high and some are scoring quite low. So again, this idea that we all have experiences related to the pandemic, but it varies from person to person. Okay, so are fears of the COVID-19 pandemic related to mental health. So now what these figures show here, we've got depressive symptoms along the x-axis. So more towards the right means higher levels of depressive symptoms, and then fears of the virus along this y-axis here. So this shows data for adolescents, and we saw that adolescent depressive symptoms are not related to their fears of the illness and virus, at least right now. But we do see that there's a moderate correlation for primary caregivers where caregivers who reported higher levels of depressive symptoms had higher fears of the virus. These two plots on the bottom here show data for adolescent anxious symptoms and caregiver anxious symptoms. And again, we're seeing some moderate correlations where both adolescents and primary caregivers who have higher anxious symptoms are also reporting greater fears of the illness and the virus. So I want to be really clear, these data do not tell us what is causing what. These are correlations. There could be a lot of things going on. For example, it might be that people who tend to have more anxious and depressive symptoms might be more prone to being concerned about the pandemic. However, it could also be that people who are more vulnerable to the negative consequences of the pandemic, so say those who have less access to resources and healthcare, or who are more affected by changing job situations, folks who are more medically vulnerable, they might be experiencing greater anxious symptoms and depressive symptoms because of hardships that have been experienced as a result of the pandemic. I will say I was kind of surprised when I saw these results here, because when we think about this, these are data that were collected within the last year, which means 2 to 3 years into the pandemic. And so what this says to me is that even 2 to 3 years into the pandemic is still having some kind of an influence on our mental health, at least for some of us, right? So I think this is really interesting and kind of points to, we need a lot more research that's going to continue on in this area to really dig into, okay, what has happened and where do we go from here? I will get to that a little bit more later on as well. In the last couple of years, in addition to studying adolescents and their primary caregivers, I also have another area of research going on that is focusing specifically on mental health and stress in university students during the pandemic. So as I mentioned a little bit before, we know that adolescent development extends. Our prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until somewhere around age 25. And so in the developmental psychology world, there's been this pitch to have this new life stage called emerging adulthood. So emerging adulthood is what happens between adolescence and adulthood, and it roughly corresponds to those who are between the ages of 18 and 25 years old. Recent data from Statistics Canada indicates that about 70% of Canadian emerging adults are enrolled in some kind of post-secondary education, such as a university program. So hence my focus on looking at university students as a way to see what's going on in emerging adulthood. I'll first give a little bit of context on this developmental period from Dr. Dave Almeida. He's one of the world leaders in adult development through midlife and older age, and he works with a lot of nationally representative American data looking at stress in our daily lives and its impacts over time spans like decades, which is super, super interesting. He came out with this paper recently that was looking at changes in the experience of daily stress over 20 years of ages. And so he describes emerging adulthood as one of the most stressful developmental periods in the lifespan. One of the reasons, as shown here, so this figure by age shows the amount of days where individuals reported experiencing stressors in their daily lives. It's highest. So kind of here, it starts at age 25 years old, but we can imagine that there's probably some similar things going on between ages 20 and 25. This makes me feel so much more optimistic about aging, just kind of being able to predict that perhaps for many of us, the number of stressors we'll experience in our daily lives will hopefully decrease over time. Anyways, when we think about it, emerging adulthood is this developmental period of almost constant role changes. So we're doing our post-secondary education, if that's what we do. We're starting careers, navigating financial independence, perhaps deepening romantic relationships in new and complicated ways. There also tend to be a lot more major life events. things like marriage, graduation, which can also bring about more daily stressors. What's really interesting is that Dr. Almeida's significant body of research now shows that the hassles of daily life, so things like conflicts, work and school stress, traffic problems, all of these so-called daily hassles might actually impact more on our mental and physical health as they accumulate over time than a single major stressor, such as a divorce. So when I'm talking about daily stress for the next couple of studies, I'm referring to these types of daily hassles. What was really interesting for me in terms of my own career trajectory is that I started my position here at UBC Okanagan in July 2020. So this was right in the early phases of the pandemic. The university was under lockdown for my first year on the job. And so the first research project that we did was to examine the daily stressors that undergraduate students experience during several phases of the pandemic, with the goal of trying to understand whether changing pandemic conditions might be related to the stressors that they experienced in daily life. So this timeline here, it's a little bit overwhelming. I guess that's kind of on purpose. It's kind of like a retrospective of all of the many, well, not even all, but most of the big changes that we experienced in British Columbia as a province, but also locally at UBCO in terms of what types of lockdown restrictions were in place. And so this shows when we collected data for 4 different time points from 4 different groups of students that ended up corresponding to vastly different pandemic conditions. So in the research world, this is called a natural experiment. So instead of the researcher randomly assigning participants to some kind of experimental manipulation, natural circumstances just kind of create the experimental conditions for you, which is what happened with this study, which we didn't really predict, but it is what happened. So we first collected data in winter of 2021. And so for cohort 1, this sample was fully under lockdown. There were no in-person teaching or research activities at the university during that cohort. Cohort 2 was collected shortly after BC announced the reopening plan and lifted lockdown restrictions. So these colors here correspond to what were initially the different phased approaches that the province had planned, which I think that plan maybe got abandoned as things changed. But so we were into stage 1 and stage 2 of that initial reopening plan when we were collecting data from cohort 2. Cohort 3 happened in the fall of 2021. And so this was shortly after many students returned back to in-person classes for the first time, although there were still a number of online activities as well. In between cohorts 3 and 4, Omicron happened. And so UBCO had pivoted back to online learning for about a month, but we didn't start collecting data for cohort 4 until that was lifted and the students were back in person again. So complicated natural experimental design. Just know that roughly when I'm talking about cohorts, the higher the number, the less locked down the cohorts were. So we collected data from 609 students at UBC Okanagan, again, using this daily diary method, where they reported every day for 14 days on their experience of stressors. So here I've shown data for one participant. These are all the stressors that they reported over the 14 days of the study. So just like Dave Almeida's work, we were looking at these daily hassles. So things like conflicts with others, stressors at home or family. So being worried about something, say, happening to a family member, work or school stressors, so on and so forth. So first we looked at whether the experience of daily stressors differed by cohort, which again corresponds to pandemic condition. These plots that I'm going to show, they're a little bit complicated. So what they show is the time until the occurrence of a stressor event along the x-axis, and then the number of stressor events along the y-axis, where basically every single individual was represented by a tiny little line. So these longer lines indicate individuals who had a longer time until the event occurred. What I want you to focus on, because I have several of these plots to show, is whether the shapes of these plots differ between the 4 cohorts. So for here, the data showing the time until any stressor event occurred, we did not see differences by cohort, which was surprising. Here are the data for experiencing conflicts. We also found that the risks of experiencing conflicts in daily life did not vary by cohort. Same story, the time until experiencing a family or a home stressor did not vary by cohort. and also the time until experiencing a work or a school stressor did not vary by cohort. We were surprised by this. I have a couple thoughts on why this might be, but we also dug in a more nuanced way to the daily experiences of our university students. And so here are results that are led by research assistant Alyssa Truong and PhD candidate Gizem Keskin. So in addition to getting data on stressors, we also looked at what positive events were happening in daily life. So here I've shown data for one individual and all the types of positive events that we looked at, and we're focusing specifically on positive remote social interactions. So this means having a positive interaction with someone else remotely, whether it's via text, video call, phone call, that kind of thing. So we were interested in whether positive remote interactions were related to students' loneliness and how they felt each day, and whether this varied by what was going on with lockdown context. What we found, first, not surprising, is that students were less lonely on weekends compared to weekdays. So perhaps they're socializing more in different ways on weekends. We also found that for students who were less lonely in general, the effect of having a positive remote interaction on their experience of loneliness that same day was less strong. So these positive remote interactions tended to be more impactful for students who were more lonely in general. Finally, what was really interesting was that students tended to be less lonely on days when they had positive remote social interactions, except for in cohort 3, which was when students returned to in-person classes for the first time. So what we're making sense of this, like how we're thinking about this, is that perhaps that experience of transitioning back to more in-person social interaction temporarily made the impact or the salience of these remote interactions, it lessens that impact, if that makes sense. So again, I'm really excited about these results, and we have kind of a mountain of data that we're still working on. So hopefully I'll have more results from this study to share in the future as well. But I think this is a really interesting example of what exactly day-to-day life looked like for university students here at UBCO. So coming back to this idea of all of these changes that happened over the course of the pandemic, it was surprising that we didn't really see for our students that the types of stressors they reported in daily life didn't change. You might be asking, well, what about the bigger stuff like mental health symptoms or higher levels of stress, not just the daily hassles? We do have those data, and we did look at those between cohorts, and we did not see differences by cohorts on the amount of mental health issues that students reported. So I think that one way to interpret this is a story about resilience. Also, when we think about context as well, it might be that many university students, they might be people who have more access to resources. So they're able to go to school because they're part of a university. They might have more connections to university-specific resources that others might not have. So at least the story that our data tell is that things have been mixed, but not majorly disruptive for our students at UBC Okanagan. Again, speaking in terms of general trends and not for specific individuals, of course. As I wrap up in these last couple of minutes, I want to talk briefly about where do we go from here? So coming back to our previous findings, that we know that the pandemic has been this shared historical event and one that varies from person to person, and context is everything. So one thing I want to point out is that the studies that I've presented on here today, these are samples that tend to have a high representation of individuals who are white in their ethnicity. They tend to be higher in socioeconomic status. So we're not necessarily getting the full picture. I think it's also really important that we recognize that other people have very different experiences of the pandemic than our own and how it might relate to mental health. So I also want to mention as well that research always lags behind the current context. So one thing that I've been hearing about a lot more anecdotally is that now that kids are going back to schools, the transition has been a fair bit harder for them, especially in the high school context. So perhaps the initial decrease that we saw in adolescent anxiety when lockdown hit, we're kind of starting to see perhaps greater increases in anxious symptoms as we're all kind of navigating our new daily life again. So of course, research always lags behind, so we'll need updates from research in the future on this. So we do see some detrimental effects in some ways, but we also see resilience in others. And I want to bring up some of the key themes of this year's Mental Health Week, which is empathy. And the CMHA talks a lot about how it's important to support others when you can, and when you can't do that, lean on others. And the theme this year about our stories is all about getting real about how to help. And especially before you weigh in on someone else's story that they share with you, make sure to tune in. So they say when someone is struggling, they don't need you to fix it. They need you to really listen and to understand. So before I point to some final resources, I'm going to go through a really quick practical suggestion on how do we actually do this. We're not always taught how to communicate with other people when they share with us that they're having a hard time. So when we see that someone we know and love is having a hard time, it's very natural to just want to jump right into problem-solving mode. Sometimes that can be helpful, but if someone is feeling a very strong negative emotion, doing that can actually make them feel like they haven't been heard, which is kind of the opposite of what we want to do. Also, when we have a really strong negative emotion, we just are not in the right headspace to problem solve. So what do we do instead? So there's 5 steps to this validation process. And the first is to simply attend to the emotion. What are other people doing? How do they behave? If you see that someone doesn't seem like themselves, label it. Hey, you look upset, or I noticed you don't really seem like yourself today. What's going on with that? And if they share what they're experiencing with you, you can validate that experience, such as by saying, oh, well, thank you so much for sharing. I'm sorry to hear that you're really sad today. Do you want to talk more about that? So just sharing that it's okay to have that emotion. Then you can help meet that need that's associated with the emotion. So often for sadness, we need soothing. If someone's experiencing shame, we need reassurance. If someone's angry, then perhaps that's a sign that we need some help with setting boundaries for some reason. Then, usually at that point, the big negative feeling will have resolved, and only then is it okay to go into problem-solving mode. Because like I said, when we're having big feelings, we're just not going to be able to be good problem solvers. But notice that the problem solving comes at the very end of all of these 5 steps. So these are some tips. I hope that maybe they are helpful for you to maybe starting to get more conversations going or moving forward as we encounter people who, when we're sharing stories about our own mental health. I want to finish with just sharing a couple of resources for mental health, both locally and through the province. So the first, these are 2 that I have some affiliation with, although not particularly formally. So the psychology clinic here at UBC Okanagan, they have a walk-in wellness service that offers including free virtual access to mental health care to anyone in the province of British Columbia, which is excellent. The second local resource is the Bridge Youth and Family Services. So I serve on their board of directors, and we offer an awful lot of services, all the way from perinatal mental health services, all the way through addiction and recovery services for adults. And then if you're not local, but you're in other locations of BC, Foundry is a really great resource. They have local service in many different areas throughout the province, specifically for youth aged 12 to 24. I think they also offer primary care services as well. And then finally, HealthLink BC is the provincial government's hub for access to various mental health and substance use related services. Finally, there's an exciting event tomorrow that I know I'm excited to go to. So Family Smart is offering a 2-hour webinar with Dr. Ross Green, who is an expert in working with children and youth who have behavioral issues with through something called collaborative and proactive solutions. So he's a major leader in this field of research. So if you're able to attend, you'll get links to all of the resources that I've mentioned today after our call today. So that is it for me. I want to thank all of my collaborators, students, and research assistants who have been involved in all of this work. And for now, I welcome your questions.
Oh, that was really wonderful, Jess. Really great. And so I encourage people to type in any questions or comments into the chat box. We'd be delighted to have a conversation with you in the last few minutes that we have together today. And I'm going to just start it off, Jess. You talked about fear of the pandemic, and I guess I'm wondering, and I don't know if you collected data on whether people's participation in public health measures reduce that fear and stress. So I think of wearing masks, washing hands, vaccines. Do we have any idea, either through your research or others, whether this helps reduce the stress related to the pandemic? And I'm not sure if you're talking about stress of the pandemic or stress of getting COVID. So the two are kind of related, but not exactly the same.
This is such a great question. It's so interesting. And I will start off by saying that I don't have a specific answer for you, but I can address parts of it. So the specific measure that I was using in the data that I presented on from my own lab, that is a measure that aggregates across different aspects of what you mentioned. So participants report not only on their current behaviors for mitigating the risk of getting COVID, so mask wearing, washing hands, sanitizing hands, intentionally opting out of in-person social events, but it also measures that other aspect, which is just the worries about yourself getting sick or a loved one getting sick and that kind of thing as well. So I didn't look specifically at those different dimensions of that scale, although I certainly could. I think the question about adherence to restrictions is so interesting and whether that decreases anxiety. And I did not collect data on that. And I have not seen anyone else collecting data on that. I think what's an interesting challenge there is that if there are ways to somehow gather data, perhaps by what was published by different governmental jurisdictions, to have this objective indication rather than participants reporting what they thought the restrictions were, because we all lost track of things at some point, right? We saw so many changes. So I think that that would be one way to look at that, is what were the actual restrictions? Did participants report adhering to them? And was that related to things like anxiety? Yeah, I'm not sure, but really, really interesting question.
Yes, because I think fear could prompt us all to, well, I'm thinking of myself, prompt me to use those health measures to protect myself. But if your level of fear is too high, I think it might immobilize you to some extent as well. So,
yes,
and become detrimental. So there's this, seems to be this fine balance that you need to maneuver through.
Exactly. Well, I like to say we have our emotions for a reason. If we're experiencing anxiety, it's probably a pretty good, it can be sometimes a good indication that there's something serious that we need to pay attention to and to take action on. But as you mentioned, of course, there's a level where the anxiety is in that disorder category when it might not be particularly well mapped onto our actual circumstances and could be more of a problem.
Yeah. So there is a question from Tylin Michelon. You were talking about, back on slide 15 or 16, I think, strong relationships with moms and dads were linked to better mental health, regardless of the stress between, regardless of the COVID stress and the difference between relationships with mom and dad, and what relationships were protective against. Were there gender differences in these findings?
They found gender differences for the parents. Sorry, so
Yes.
for the protective role of parents, they found gender differences, but I believe they did not find gender differences for the adolescents, which is interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Very interesting. And so when you, in your sample, when you talk about the primary caregiver and parents, did your sample include an equal number of moms and dads, or were moms reporting on behalf of the family?
This is a really interesting question. So my sample right now is primarily moms who are participating. We also have an active area of research going on right now, led by my PhD student, Marcus Gottlieb, looking at that specifically. Why is it that moms tend to be more likely to participate in research studies like this than dads? So it's not that we're not welcoming of fathers participating in our studies, but we've seen this for decades in developmental psychology research, that moms tend to be the ones who sign up for these studies. And there are lots of reasons for this. And we are actively working on trying to make our practices within my own lab more inclusive so that we can better represent all types of caregivers, not just moms and dads, in these types of research studies.
Yeah, that's great to hear. So there is a comment from Mary. Does the research show that people have returned to their usual activity levels, or are they still hesitant about some social situations such as large group events?
I do not have data on this, but when I think about the people around me and the things that I see, I think I see a mix, right? And I think we can all kind of think about what are the people around us doing. So I think many folks, again, speaking anecdotally, have moved back to their normal, typical day-to-day lives. Honestly, I think that there were some people who did not adhere to any COVID restrictions and perhaps did not have that type of disruption. But I'm still hearing personally too that some folks continue to be a little bit more hesitant than others in terms of returning. And I know, even myself, I had a longer time until my own kind of first emergence related to my own personal circumstances too, right? So I think, again, the message that we are all kind of finding our own ways back to new normal, but it looks very different for almost every single individual also rings true here. And sorry for not having a more concrete answer to your question, Mary.
No, I think that's quite interesting. I must admit, I was a little bit shocked the first time I walked into Costco and they had taken down those glass barriers between us and the cashier. I immediately felt badly for the cashiers, thinking, oh my gosh, maybe they won't be protected anymore. That was my first reaction. And I still, kind of look at that because some stores still have the barrier up and other stores don't. And I sometimes wonder about what effect that has on the workers. And it's just interesting how we got so used to one way of how we see things happening in things like grocery stores, and then all of a sudden they change back to normal and it looks abnormal.
Exactly. So, yes.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting. We also have a comment from Erica. I love the sound of that study, mom versus dad. Very interesting. But I agree with you. I agree with Erica that it's so important to, and yourself, so important to include the dads and the variety of caregivers in all of our research, because I think for a long time we kind of left them out.
Yes, exactly.
So another comment from Tylin, just curious if you've done any work on relationships between adolescents and mentors or other close relationships, but not family, not necessarily specific to COVID-19. And if so, do you have any papers or studies I could read about? So
my short answer, my short answer here is no. I do know that there is a medium-sized research literature on teens' relationships with coaches, because extracurricular activities such as sports can play such an important role in adolescents' positive development. But that is outside of my area, and I don't know if any research has looked at those types of relationships and how they might have been impacted by COVID. So short answer is no, but really, really interesting question. We know that having just one positive relationship with an adult doesn't have to be a parent. Maybe it's a teacher, maybe it's a mentor or a coach of some kind. We know that can do an awful lot of good things for adolescents who might not have access to, say, family members who are supportive and safe people to be around. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think we probably all have personal examples that we can think of where whether parents might not be around, or it's just that the adolescent has a really strong relationship with someone outside the family that really gets them through the tough times and is there when adolescents need them. Well, and that applies to everybody, really.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
This has been really, really fabulous. And what a great way to recognize Canadian Mental Health Week to be talking about our responses to COVID, but also just how we manage all those daily hassles. And thank you so much for sharing your research with us today and for all of the advice and resources that you provided at the end. And I want to also thank everyone for joining us today. It's been really great to see so many people join. And you will be getting a short evaluation form at the end, and we will also send out a link to the recording Again, thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you'll join us in the future for another event. And special thanks to Jess as well for joining us today. So thanks everyone, and bye for now.
Thanks, everybody.